Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming and welcome. So today I'm going to be talking about contemporary American spiritual warfare, building on some of the research I did for my book and kind of going forward. I'm going to be talking about the ambiguity of the relationship between affliction and affiliation, the way that in contemporary spiritual warfare in America specifically, the construction of individuals or often groups of people as demoniacally afflicted feeds into a kind of accusation of affiliation between what those groups are seen to represent to American spiritual warriors in the contemporary context. Just to get started, I'm going to kind of go over a bit about what spiritual warfare is in contemporary America. So spiritual warfare is a concept that's been, it's a fairly old concept in Christianity. It's present from, it's very particularly big in both in late antiquity and also in early modernity, and essentially refers to the idea of actively combating malevolent spiritual forces that exist in the world at large and which influence the material world. Today, its manifestations are mostly tied to Pentecostal or the Charismatic revival, which started in the kind of early 20th century or the late 18th century. And within the United States, they are practices which have spread to American evangelicalism broadly from the kind of mid-1980s onwards. Today, spiritual warfare exists less as a separate part of separate denominations, but is often just a feature found throughout US Protestant evangelical denominations, as well as in certain Catholic groups and Eastern Orthodox groups in the United States as well. It's this kind of pan-denominational phenomenon. So its core tenet is the belief in the literal reality of the spirit world, both of angels and of demons, but more specifically, the belief that this spirit world underlies and impacts the organizations of the material world, whether that is in individual sickness or poverty, systemic issues, or in the even in the kind of rise and fall of nations. Everything is kind of traced back to these underlying spiritual forces. Sean McLeod, in his book on American spiritual warfare, American Possessions, refers to this as a supernatural hermeneutics of suspicion, this idea that the base of reality on which everything else is superstructurally built is fundamentally this kind of supernatural conflict between light and darkness, God and the devil, angels and demons. Demons are fought both with practices of ritual, primarily prayer, and political actions. And one of the main ways through which these ideas are disseminated, and one of the core aspects of my research, the core research materials that I use, are spiritual warfare manuals. These are 3 such manuals depicted here. And throughout this talk, I'm going to be showing a kind of wide variety of spiritual warfare manuals, which are designed to inform and instruct believers, both often on the reality of the demonic. These are often targeted at Christians or members of evangelical groups that are perhaps not convinced of the reality of the demonic, and the books are intended to kind of to draw out and draw the connections, and also to explain why and how demons act in the world. Cindy Jacobs' The Supernatural Life is far more personal. It's far more focused on the influence of demons in individual lives and in families. The one at the bottom, Forbidden Gates, is a far more conspiratorial text. It's focused on kind of technology and global governance and things like that. And the other one, Stealth Attack by Ray Pritchard, is kind of somewhere in between, but uses the war on terror as an extended metaphor for discussing how contemporary demons work, often drawing explicit and implicit parallels between God and the United States. The manuals often sit on a kind of spectrum ranging from kind of self-help books on one end to kind of conspiracist tracts about global governance and the coming end times on the other. Yeah, so primarily today I'm going to be talking about the construction of threat and the way that spiritual warfare and constructions of witness exist in contemporary America. So the US is primarily privileged in a lot of American spiritual warfare discourse. It's situated in a line with broader discourses of American exceptionalism as this kind of, as at once invincible and yet deeply vulnerable to spiritual attack. These attacks can come both kind of from within and from without. Yeah, but in general, they construct America as a seat of divine authority, often the seat of divine authority on the earth. You see this a lot in their missionary discourses, especially, in which the US is positioned as the kind of seat from which true Christianity is like spread out to the world, and then later often kind of caught back in moments of crisis. You saw this, for example, when Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. His spiritual advisor, Paula White, who was one of these, this particular form of Christianity, prayed for the angels to return from overseas in Africa and South America to come and intervene in the US election and maintain Trump's hold over the nation. American power and American purity, often constructed in sexual, racial, and religious tones, is constructed as something that must be maintained. This often relates to what the scholar Nikhil Pal Singh writes in his analysis of American race and American empire as America's imperial statecraft, that which segregates and eliminates enemies both within and without. He calls America's inner and outer wars. In spiritual warfare, this plays out in intertwined narratives of both sexual and racial threats to the normative family and to the normative nation. And ultimately kind of ties the relationship that my work broadly is concerned with between demonologies as discourses about the existence and activities of malevolent spiritual entities, and demonization as the sociopolitical processes by which peoples are dehumanized and targeted for conversion and as processes of elimination. So now I'm going to be talking kind of about two constructions of threat and of kind of demonic witness that occur in these contemporary discourses. So I'm going to be talking specifically about the relationship between sort of discourses of gender and sexuality, but then also in constructions of Islam in American evangelical Christianity. So content warnings for discussions of kind of homophobia, misogyny, and Islamophobia in the coming slides. So first of which I'm going to be talking about is the spirit of Jezebel. These are several spiritual warfare manuals depicted here, which deal with this spirit. So Jezebel is a relatively ubiquitous figure in contemporary spiritual warfare. Technically genderless, as all spirits are, but frequently and highly gendered as feminine. Jezebel is constructed as the entity or entities behind such varied phenomenon as contemporary feminism, LGBT rights, the fight for reproductive rights in contemporary America, immigration, the international drug trade, and a variety of other things. Jezebel is a force which is seen as breaking down the normative boundaries around normative constructions of the family and the nation. She's often also related to kind of abusive interpersonal dynamics between members of communities. It's very common, for example, for overbearing preachers or indeed members of a congregation who perhaps get a bit out of line and start questioning the leader's authority to be accused of being with a spirit of Jezebel as a way of undermining their either their authority or their challenges to authority. Jezebel is highly related to constructions of gender and sexuality. In 2016 and in the 90s, she was highly associated with the figure of Hillary Clinton in a lot of these discussions as a kind of emblem of the shifting role of women in America, like in the 90s, and then as a continuation of that in her challenge to Trump in 2016. There was Jezebel is a figure who there are often just books about in every year, but there was a sudden surge of them in 2015 and 2016. That sort of suddenly emerged within the field of kind of this form of evangelical publishing. Perhaps one of the most recent books, which was published, I believe, in 2020, is Michael L. Brown's here, Jezebel's War with America, the plot to destroy our country and what we can do to turn the tide. This is a fairly representative sample of something which takes the figure of Jezebel out of a more personal or familiar aspect to construct her as this overarching threat to the United States. And particularly to like certain forms of Christian nationalist understandings of the United States. Often white Christian nationalists, sometimes more multicultural, multiracial understandings of America, but very, very specifically America as Christian and as not as a pluralist democracy. It's very common in contemporary discourse over the last couple of years, for example, to see Jezebel as the force behind pushes for the continuation of reproductive rights in America and for the securing of rights for LGBT citizens of the United States. And as a result, the kind of overthrow of those things we see recently, for example, in the repeal of Roe versus Wade, for example, in the United States, often accredited within these circles as victories against the spirit of Jezebel, who has been enshrined in law or in governance and thus needs to be dethroned and removed from office. The other one I'm going to talk about briefly now is the construction of Islam in these movements. Islam has been constructed as a threat within evangelical discourse in the United States for a considerable length of time. But it really began to surge first in the post-Cold War period after the fall of communism, tracking with the kind of broader construction of clash of civilization narratives in the United States. And then especially in the kind of post 9/11 era. All four of these books here were written in the years kind of following 9/11. The earliest is Ralph Stice's From 9/11 to 666 here, which came out, I believe, in 2005. The Islamic Antichrist was 2006 and then republished in 2009. The Coming Fall of Islam in Iran was, I believe, 2007. And the final one, End Times and the Secrets of the Mahdi, is a 2014 book. Michael Youssef here, who is a originally Egyptian-born American Christian, has written a book, I believe, every year since 2013, mostly on the same topic, and shows no sign of slowing down at this point. These are all books which draw on kind of wider Islamophobic narratives that are kind of prevalent within American social and political discourse, kind of particularly in the post 9/11 era. They often construct the idea of Islam as sort of antithetical or something radically outside of the United States, something which comes from without. But often specifically also as something which threatens to replace Christianity. They'll often point, most of these books, for example, will longer about conversion rates to Islam in the United States, particularly among African-American communities, as signs of a kind of shifting demographic and religious threat to this these ideas of America as a Christian nation, and often specifically as a very white Christian nation. In general, they call for, one of the interesting aspects of these is that they're often very, very focused on conversion. And they often intersect with wider reactionary discourses in the contemporary United States and also in the contemporary West broadly, which tend to be focused very much on what are sometimes called like replacement theories, these kind of reactionary fears of the coming demographic replacement of often kind of white Europeans by some form of othered racialized group. In Europe, this is often Muslims. In the US, it oscillates between Muslims who are racialized as Middle Eastern, but also Latin American people who are racialized as perhaps improperly Christian, or as still containing some trend of like indigenous witchcraft, as they often speak about them. These books differ from often some of these wider replacement conspiracies in that they often focus specifically on conversion, and on conversion like as a specific threat to the kind of nativist integrity of the United States. So I am aware I'm short on time. So these are kind of two examples of the way that demonic action in the United States is constructed as oscillating between affliction and affiliation. These are often groups that are identified by spiritual warriors as afflicted by demons, as needing to be saved. This is why the focus on conversion kind of exists, for example, this idea that these people just need to be saved out of their kind of demoniac possession and redeemed into the light. But these processes work as ways of undermining American pluralism, American diversity, the kind of heterogeneity of American democracy, in an effort to kind of homogenize and constrict American public and political life. To conclude briefly, contemporary spiritual warfare practices construct links between demonization as affliction by malevolent spirits and demonization as social othering and dehumanization. Spiritual warfare articulates and constructs and imposes systems of right order over various legions of heterogeneous others, and blurs together disparate groups into kind of singular demonic forces threatening some construction of quote unquote real America. This in turn fuels wider reactionary shifts in US politics, visible in growing events like January 6th, the QAnon movement, and the growing widespread belief among the American right of like ideas of replacement. In general, this relates to the social and political structures the texts identify as marking those with demons, the forms of politics and of personal identity that are constructed as objects to fear and as threats to American public and political life. Thank you.